Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Something I am really looking forward to doing leading into the 2024 election and beyond is looking at new political movements and ideas that are entering into the landscape. It's pretty clear that after 8 years of this Trump plus era, we are due for new sets of ideas and institutions. And the first of which I'm going to be cataloging today is something called the abundance agenda. Teles has been on the podcast before, and I'm excited to share his new paper. It's called The Rise of the Abundance Faction. It really gets at this idea of the abundance agenda and how it could present a new opportunity within the center to center left of the Democratic Party to offer something alternative to what we have now. At a broader level, we also discuss the end point of political moderation, why democracy reform efforts haven't worked, and lots of other great stuff too. This is part one of a longer term conversation I'm going to schedule during this summer, so look forward to hearing what folks think. We reference a lot of different really interesting papers in this episode, so be sure to check the show notes. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Stephen Teles, welcome back to the Realignment.
Thanks for having me back on.
So we're here to discuss a couple really interesting pieces. You just published with your co-author, Rob Salden, The Rise of the Abundance Faction, which has to deal with the future of American politics. But I think it'd be really important to set up this conversation with just a quick diagnosis of our current political moment, separate from how you think someone should respond to this political moment, i.e. the abundance faction in your case. Can you give us a June 2024, where are we, where have we been, and how does that matter for this conversation today?
Yeah, well, thank you again. Thank you for having me on. So I would say that on the one hand, I'm more optimistic than most people, but that's because most people are so unbelievably pessimistic. And so you don't have to be that optimistic in order to be more optimistic than most people. I would say I'm optimistic long-term, and it's hard not to be pessimistic short-term. I'm optimistic long-term because I do think some of underneath the surface of this political moment, there are changes that will make American politics healthier. And this is where it may be worth going back a little bit, or actually a lot, all the way back to the beginning of our constitutional system to explain why I'm actually optimistic, which is our political system is, for a lot of design reasons, basically a two-party system. So it's very hard, given the fact that we have first past the post elections by district, that all that sort of what you might think of as the hard wiring of our constitutional system means that we only have two parties, and yet we have an enormously pluralistic, heterogeneous society, one of the most heterogeneous. And so the basic problem of American politics is, how do you take an enormously heterogeneous society and somehow shove it into only two parties? And other countries deal with their heterogeneity by having lots of parties. So I always use the example of Holland, which, again, I love Holland. My mother-in-law is from Holland, right? But almost to a first approximation, almost nobody lives in Holland, and yet they have an enormous number of parties. They have a party that gets seats in their legislature called the Party for Animals. And as the name goes, they're a party for animals. It's amazing that with the size country that Holland is, they have as many parties as they have, and we only have two. So the challenge in our system is, how do you actually get people to see themselves in the political system when there's only two parties to do that from? And traditionally in American history, we did that by having parties that were internally heterogeneous, even though there were only two of them, right? And so if you go back in American history, the Republican Party had stalwart Republicans, conservative Republicans, it had progressive Republicans, and the party was a kind of shell in which those, in some sense, way more fundamental components made decisions, right? And they made decisions by bargaining and negotiation inside, and also by making deals with the party, the party factions and the other party that they were actually closer to. And that's the historical model. That's the really sort of intrinsically hardwired thing we did. Now, we've had an experiment really since the early 1990s with trying to do it another way, which was actually having two more or less homogenous parties without a lot of factional differentiation inside them. And I think a lot of people's dislike of our system comes from the fact that they can't see themselves in those two parties that are often only offering two fairly homogenous packages, as opposed to saying, there's a faction in this party, and that sounds like who I am, right? Now, I'm not using this as a great example. I don't want to get a Joe Biden kind of thing, right? But there used to be conservative, like really conservative Democrats, right? And they were segregationists, right? And people could look at it and say, well, the Democratic Party as a whole, I don't know what I think of that. But there is a part of it that's clearly the faction for people like me, right? And they were Union Democrats who thought, yeah, there's the whole Democratic Party, that's not like for me, but there is a faction that's for me. And we've had an experiment with trying to do it with homogenous parties, and I don't think it's worked. And I think that is already, we can see the tectonic process of that breaking down more on the extremes, right? So you have Freedom Caucus, which is really a particular faction in the Republican Party. You have what I refer to as the DSA faction in the Democratic Party. That's the left, and that doesn't mean everybody's in the DSA, but that's just a symbol of what I mean. And so the parties are already starting to break down from their extremes. And I would say the real problem is they're not breaking down closer to what you might consider to be the center. Although we can talk about why center and moderation and everything like that is itself a kind of problematic concept. So there's my big picture is if we can get past this moment, right, to a moment when the parties go back to being more internally heterogeneous, when there will be a populist faction in the Republican Party, but also a libertarian faction, and you can imagine what the other factions in the Republicans and is similar in the Democratic Party, then our system can go back to working sort of constitutionally the way it's supposed to. But we have to get through this crisis moment when they're not in order to get there.
Yeah, a couple of things, because this is really fascinating. On number one, I think the key thing about understanding your history of American factional politics is that that history has nothing to do with our traditional like moderate versus left or moderate versus right idea, because moderation is a disposition. It's not necessarily a policy agenda. And you could have, let's say, mugwumps or civil service reformers in the Republican Party of the 1880s who were moderate in disposition, but that agenda was kind of radical. We're thinking about making America move away from the spoils system, on and on and on and on and on. So I think one of the big problems that's actually hamstrung people who think of themselves as political moderates. So they say to themselves, okay, I'm a moderate. I don't like this dominant faction that rules my party, so I'm going to organize other moderates. But if we look at our history and the history you just told, that's actually not a coherent understanding of how political systems actually operate. And you'd actually be much better thinking, hey, I am a Silicon Valley Democrat. I'm more in favor of free markets versus like socialism. I should organize Silicon Valley Democrats around an agenda. And I'm sure there's things we could do with New Deal Democrats, or we could certainly do things with Green New Deal Democrats if we're talking about clean tech and technology. That would just be a smarter starting point than just this, like, are you a moderate? Are you an extremist thing? So could you talk about
Yeah.
that history over the past 12 years?
Yeah. So the problem I think is that, and again, I used to identify as a moderate, so this is where I'm asking for forgiveness a little bit. That Yeah, there's a difference between having a moderate disposition, as you described it, right? And the problem with that is it doesn't really tell you what the actual distinct policy agenda or governance agenda is. And the danger is that people who have identified as moderates have mostly, their policy agenda has mostly been, I would like to water down the dominant faction by 20%,
Yep.
right? So whatever they're for, right? And you see this in the Republican Party too, right? Where they're like, well, that's a little too much, right? Let's back it off, right? Whatever the tax cut the Republicans want, we want a little bit less of a tax cut than that. Now that's moderation in some sense. It's what you might call sort of watering down moderation, but it's not a distinct policy agenda that's saying, here is the actual way we want to govern the country different, not just on a single dimension, but we have some
Mhm.
other entirely other dimension that we want to inject into politics. And that's in the paper that we're talking about. That's the reason why I'm talking about the progressives, right? And your example of like silver Democrats, right? There was a period in which the entire political system was divided around things like the tariff and monetary policy, and that's what everyone was arguing. And what the progressives did is they did not come in saying, we would like a more moderate position on monetary policy. They said, hey, here's a whole set of issues that nobody's talking about, right?
Mhm.
Civil service reform, reform in the military, right? Which was actually a very big part of at least some people who are in the progressives, is they said, look, we have this military that's organized around state militias, and we really need to build a modern, centralized, bureaucratic military, right? And police reform. There was all these other things that were part of that set of issues, and they were injecting into the political system. And that's what I think I'm saying we really need to be doing now, is have a faction organized around not the traditional things that Democrats and Republicans are used to competing around, but another set of issues on which they might be actually quite recalcitrant and radical and wanting to change what we're doing in a quite dramatic way. But it's doing that by talking about some entirely different set of issues. And that's a lot of what we're doing in this paper by talking about an abundance faction. It's about connecting an intellectual social movement agenda to and injecting that into party politics and getting us to actually be talking about something different than we've been talking about for the last 30 years.
Yeah, so two quick things before we get into the specifics of the abundance agenda and the theory there. I think that poll result, the polls are kind of weird right now in either direction, but a poll result that just fascinates me is the New York Times Siena poll result from April. It basically said 70% of the electorate wants to overturn the system in some way. And I think that that's whole result is going to be hyper subject to misinterpretation in so many different directions. So if you're a Bernie Democrat, you say to yourself, exactly, that's why we said we need to have, universal single payer healthcare. That's what overturning the system looks like to us. Or if you're a radical Republican, you say, okay, like that's an example of why we need MAGA times two to come back. And we need to really sort of take apart the deep state, take apart the government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My takeaway from that I think is why this paper is right up my alley is I see the 70% and I see, okay, what that fundamentally means is that there is a real constituency for ideology that frames itself around reform, change of the system itself, in a way that's pretty practical and pretty focused on what's actually really happening there, and in a way that I think isn't going to run into various dead ends. Like, for example, the reason why we're not going to see the Bernie Sanders single payer healthcare transformation is like we're now in an inflationary political system. People are talking about debt and deficits again. Any reform that requires vast expenditure of trillions of dollars is not going to happen under a Biden reelect or a Trump win either way. So where are the radical reform agenda pieces that could fit into this constrained 2020s environment? I think the abundance agenda fits into that. So I'd be curious what you think about this
Let
dynamic.
me say, so I think the one thing we're trying to get across in this paper is not necessarily to think just about policy reform. Like, let's go. The problem is people don't like the fact that there's like some discrete policy and we haven't passed it. If we passed it, everybody be happy, right? The book that I thought a lot about in writing this is this great book by Steve Skowronek called Building a New American State. And that gets again back to this parallel of the progressives. What the progressives thought is the entire way that the system was governed was wrong, right? That
Mm-hmm.
is what Skowronek calls this, the state of courts and parties, right? That's how we governed ourselves, through courts and through patronage machines. And so while they had like specific things they wanted to do, they wanted regulation of monopolies or whatever it was, right? More broadly, they had a critique of the fundamental DNA of the governing system. And they said, look, we need to build what for them was a modern state. Now, we can talk a lot about what the problems with the state that they built in some sense, we're trying to fix some of the things that were the pathologies of the state that they built, but they were trying to build an entirely new state structure, right? Not just make this or that reform. And this and that reform fit into, for them, a broader vision of what was wrong with how we were governed as a whole. And I think that really makes sense, right? When you think about that 70% of people who just think like everything's screwed up, right? It's partially because, right, we just do keep screwing up, right? And we do have
There's some empirical reality there.
And like nobody gets held responsible, nobody gets dragged through the street, right? You know, when you think about all the things that could happen, right? And so as a result of that, a lot of that just keeps building up, right? The stuff from the financial crisis, the stuff from the tech bubble, the stuff from the Iraq war, right? You can keep going, the COVID, right? And that, what it ends up doing is it leads to a general system alienation, right? I think that's what you're describing, is that just everything, right? And we've got all of these policy problems. None of the things that are being done seem at scale, right? Again, we have a healthcare problem, we have a housing problem, and yet nothing the state seems to do, even, it doesn't even seem like they're trying to solve it. They're not even like messing up trying to solve it, right? And that suggests there's something wrong, again, at that level of the fundamental DNA of the governance system. And that's what this idea of abundance is essentially directing us to, is we need a reform agenda that's at the scale of our governance problem, right? The governance problem produced by the pathology of the previous system. And I know from what you're interested in, also the scale of our geopolitical problems, right? And again, that was a problem that the progressives were facing as well, right? They were saying, look, the United States is becoming the preeminent country. If you just look at our economy, our wealth, right? But we haven't been able to translate that wealth into power. As you know, Fareed Zakaria had this great book called From Wealth to Power that was about why we had this long delay between becoming the wealthiest country in the world and the most powerful country in the world. And that's because we had all these problems in our basic state structure that made it hard to transfer economic power into geopolitical power. And I think we're having a problem now where our actual geopolitical position is going to be challenged by the problems at our economic level, right? If we can't actually get both our economic, if we can't, get growth higher, we can't get total factor productivity up, we're not going to have the resources in order to be able to compete and project power. And so that's where I think both of those things are going on in the way that they were going on in the late 19th century.
Yeah, and I think the place where the geopolitics intersects really interestingly with the abundance agenda stuff is really at the state capacity level. So in the sense of, if we're looking at like where's the actual bipartisan consensus, we're asking a lot of like the post-2021, post-COVID American state, framed in geopolitical terms. Everything from like, we need to get our semiconductor resiliency up to like 20% from 12%. We need to build out EV infrastructure. There was that big clip of like Pete Buttigieg revealing that only 7 to 8 were built after, $7.5 billion were allocated relative to an actual goal of thousands and thousands and thousands. So I think there are just interesting ways that, and I think even what we just talked about is an interesting example of how factional politics work, where like a lot of my focus is like coming in from a foreign policy perspective. You could have your own domestically focused abundance agenda, and actually sometimes that's actually really going to like intersect well. If I'm doing CHIPS Act 2.0, I actually would have plenty to actually work with when it came to the abundance faction. So one last question to frame things before we let you just take it away with the agenda and the different levels of theory here. Why are you no longer interested, or are you you're pretty critical of the big, highly funded, moderate led, we need to transform American democracy project? Because when you're describing all of these problems in this first section of the episode, I've interviewed Catherine Gale, I've had Lee Drutman on, I've spoken with a lot of these people, and there was just a real theory during the late 2010s and going into the 2020s that the way of addressing a lot of these dynamics and problems, the dissatisfaction, was to change the actual rules of the democracy game itself, which is separate than the point you made around changing the way governance works. Why are you pessimistic on focusing on the like who gets elected and how they get elected part of the story?
Well, let me just be specific on this because I know Lee's work a lot better than I know Catherine Gale's work. And in a way, I think Lee and I actually have a lot of the same diagnosis in that we think a lot of the basic system alienation is a function of declining political heterogeneity, right? If you think of that just as like a matching problem, right? We've got a bunch
Mhm.
of citizens out there, they've got a set of preferences. The some degree of the system alignment comes from two things, right? One, can they see themselves in the political system, right? That's the
Mhm.
degree to which they feel in that sense, just to go back to that, be a little pedantic now, right? The degree to which they find themselves represented, right? That's the root of the idea of representation is represented, right? That
Mhm.
all that heterogeneity in the political system gets represented into this smaller set of people. That's what representative democracy is, right? But most people do not see themselves represented. They can't look up and see, here's an official who's like me. I've got some idiosyncratic, view, and there's somebody like me, at least in that group of people having that fight out. And so both Lee and I think that's a fundamental problem. Now, Lee's answer is we've got to get to multi-party democracy, right? That's the only way people can get represented. And I think there's a good argument for that, and yet I see no way to get there. Right. I think
Mhm.
that's one where, the old thing where the guy asks, like, how do you get from there? And the guy says, you can't get there from here. I don't think we can get to where Lee wants from here. Right. The second thing is, system alignment or system legitimacy comes from performance. Right. So, one, it comes from representation. And the second is, do people just think this machine is mostly working? Is it mostly delivering? And this is what people call output legitimacy, right? And so clearly, our system has had an output legitimacy problem, where it's just not working, right? In all kinds of dimensions. And so I think the question of political reform, right, is how do you get a system that both has better, more heterogeneous representation and more output legitimacy? And I argue the only way you can really get there is within this system, right? Our system
Mhm.
of two-party divided, and so, there's lots of people like Ezra Klein who's been going out saying, we have a terrible constitution. And the only, Matt Iglesias often argues this. And again, I have a lot of sympathy for that. And yet I think we have the constitutional system that we've got. And we have had a traditional way of addressing a lot of their critique. And instead of wasting our time on massive constitutional level reforms that will never happen, we have a historical answer in our own tradition of heterogeneous parties, and that's also a thing we can do incrementally, right? We don't have to wait to having the whole system, right? People can go out there and organize, and we may have a talk about this sort of educate, agitate, organize later, right? You can build that thing now. You don't have to wait for institutional change. And by building that, you actually create a constituency for institutional change, right? If
Mhm.
you have enough actual power within one of the parties, you can start asking for institutional changes. And the example we give in a previous paper that we wrote called The Futurist Faction that was in National Affairs is we said, look, once parties get sufficiently heterogeneous, they can't insist on complete agenda control. They can't insist on that, the only things we're going to be dealing with in this legislature are things where the majority is entirely coherent and the opposition's totally against it. Right. And that's
Mhm.
one of the reasons why so many things where we could be doing creative legislating is not happening. It's because we have this sort of principle that the only thing that Congress can be addressing are things where the majority is entirely coherent. Once there's a large enough faction like the one we're talking about now, one thing they can demand is to say, look, as you were talking about, if you want some of your Green New Deal, one thing we are going to insist on is rules that sometimes let us make reforms with these more libertarian oriented Republicans or even sometimes more populist oriented Republicans. And so that's how I think institutionally you get from here to there.
Great. So let's get into the actual abundance. So, two questions then. So, firstly, what would you say is the abundance faction? And then secondly, what agenda do you think that faction could produce to be compelling within this framework?
So I may reverse that slightly just to
Go
get
for
so it's clear that your listeners actually know even what the hell we're talking about, right? So and again, I'm going to do a lot of like advertising for my own stuff. So I wrote a paper with Daniel Takish and Sam Hammond a few years ago called Cost Disease Socialism that basically made the argument that a lot of the problems we have, whether it's housing or health or other things, are a result of the fact that we've
college, higher education in
college, right?
general.
We've got all these supply side problems, right? That is, or energy is another one. We just don't have enough, right? And as a result of that, the basic principle in economics is we have a lot of demand and not enough supply, price goes up. Now,
Yep.
faced with the problem of prices going up, and this is where, this is another like system level alienation problem, right? Is those really fundamental goods, right, that are necessary for a middle class life keep getting more expensive, and the system doesn't seem to have any answer for that. And in response to that, the response of the left of the Democratic Party is subsidy, right? So we need to have, a renter's credit, right, to deal with the fact that people can't, that the rent's too damn high, right? We need to have single payer healthcare, right? Because we need, people can't afford healthcare, so we need to socialize the costs, right? We need to have more money. We need to bail out people who've got debt from college, right? All of those are the same kind of answer to spiraling costs, right? But the problem is, in economic terms, if you deal with spiraling costs by spending more, right? In the end, it's just going to raise the price more because then you're effectively increasing the demand, the effective demand. Faced with fixed supply, you get higher prices, right? And again, that's only going to make people more system alienated. They're going to say, look, we poured all this money into this thing, and the thing still seems to be getting more expensive. So the abundance theory is fundamentally that you've got to get out of this subsidy inflation spiral, right, by unlocking the underlying supply, right? That is, if people have, the problem is that their energy is costing too much. We've got to find a way to make energy cheaper across the board. We've got to find a way to make higher education, the actual underlying cost, not the price, but the cost lower, right? And to some degree, that's a way of solving problems that neither the left or right can solve, right? The right's answer on a lot of those things is, well, if people were just had to pay more of the cost themselves, then the price would go down. But they don't actually have a theory of how to actually produce more of those things, right? Except sometimes, if we pushed it all into the private sector, then somehow that would all go down. But there's not much theory of that. So the abundance theory is in
Oh, and
all
also,
these areas.
this is the key thing too, because if we did some dunking on the left there, this issue on the right there is there's no political theory of the case for how you actually do that. So, like another like talking point that the libertarian right loves doing in the higher ed case is they see the cost disease socialism and they say, well, stop increasing Pell Grants, stop offering Pell Grants, stop subsidizing university systems through like the loan system we have now. Good luck passing that legislation. Like there's a very literal like, how do you even get there, separate from whether or not it actually work?
Well, again, I think in lots of these cases, the answer you've got to go into these systems, right? So in
Mhm.
healthcare, right? There's all these, the problems are doctors and hospitals, right? It's actually not fundamentally insurance, right? So monkeying around with the insurance, either by making people pay more or making people pay less. And that's my point about that's the conversation we've had
Yeah.
over the last 30 years. That's that dimension, right? And the alternative dimension that we're trying to get people to focus on is this supply side dimension of saying, we just don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough dentists. We don't have enough dental hygienists. I just went to the dentist this morning, so I was thinking a lot about dental supply, right? There's lots of ways to actually make those things cheaper, but you've got to solve that problem in all of these anti-competitive cartels that have sort of built up in lots of these areas, all these ways that people can stand in the way of building more, whether it's more, energy in some cases and housing, which I think about a lot.
Hmm.
That's the thing that you've got to focus on. That's the agenda, I think, of the next 20 or 30 years. And the other part I'd put in this again is the state capacity problem. The state capacity problem, again, cuts across the left and right, right? Both the left and right have in a way contributed to the fact that our governments are just not very good at doing anything, right? On the left, it's because a lot of the NIMBY rules, the rules about public participation, were created by the left in various different ways, in part because they wanted to create opportunities for participation by the groups associated with the left, whether it was environmentalists or local housing advocates or environmental advocates or whatever you were talking about, right? On the right, they were trying to strip away state capacity by making it hard for the state to do anything, right? To make it hard for them to hire people, to make it hard for them to, especially to pay the kind of salaries you would need or to get the prestige that you would need to get good people to do these jobs and to keep them in these jobs over the long term, right? Or to build up any of the fundamental skills or capacities or resources. And one consequence of that is we pushed a lot of that knowledge, that know-how out of the state, right? We pushed it into consulting and contracting firms where the government then has to contract with it in order to get any of it, right? And that's been a kind of thing where, again, the left and right have conspired against us building planning and governance capacity inside of the government. And that's another one where I think the abundance kind of faction has a very different agenda, not a more moderate one, in some sense, a very extreme, but in a whole other 180-degree direction.
So there was some interesting writings from Derek Thompson, Ezra Klein, Tyler Cowen, which all articulate three different kind of versions of this, though Ezra and Derek are collaborating on a book together. Can you kind of give people some examples of, because we've referenced a lot of like longer papers, like, so Tyler has state capacity libertarianism, Derek Thompson has the abundance agenda Atlantic piece, and then Ezra is doing his supply side liberalism, writing in the New York Times. Can you kind of talk about these different variations that we're sort of seeing?
So the fundamental insight, or one of the fundamental insights of the paper is that all of those things you described, where I could differentiate them, but I'm going to not differentiate them because I think sociologically, the interesting thing is at least the problem they're all trying to solve is the same. Right?
Hmm.
They've all got the idea that our political system is not prioritizing this set of things enough, right? So what they're essentially saying is you're not talking about the right thing, right? You're all talking about abortion and tax rates and that kind of stuff, and that's not really our fundamental problem. And so there's differences at the margin between what Tyler Cowen is talking about from a more libertarian point of view and what Ezra is talking about. But one, I think they all agree that, again, in wonky terms, our big problem is total factor productivity, right? Just the productivity of our political system has gone down, of our economic system is too low to support the lifestyle, and I would also, again, to say the geopolitical commitments that we need. And so we've got to figure, and then the question is, where is that coming from? And I think one thing that both of these have in common is that they look for it in the state itself, right? So one of the examples often use, one of my favorite sort of wonky projects is a transit cost project that's at NYU's Marin Center. Then all they do is go out and measure like how much does it cost to build a mile of light rail here versus Italy or Spain or whatever, right? And it's just massively more expensive in the US, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just really fundamental productivity, right? If infrastructure is one of the basic inputs into productivity, right? Because input, it reduces transaction costs. It makes it easier to do division of labor, right? Those are all the classic things infrastructure does, right? We're just not getting as much of that for the dollar we spend as other countries are, or that we got in the past, right? And so, and the same thing is true for housing, right? We haven't really gotten improvements in the productivity of the housing sector for almost a half a century, right? In part because we're still building houses the same way we were building 50 years ago. And that has a lot to do with regulation, with governance structure, with all of that, right? The productivity of science. We look at everybody likes government support for science. My mom used to work at NSF, actually still sort of works at NSF, right? And a lot of what they do is they fund science. It turns out the productivity of science has gone down in the last 50 years, right? That we keep trying to shove more money, right, to try and get productivity up by shoving more money into it. And it turns out all the systems we have that are both public and private are just not good enough to really get us really big gains out of that. And so when you look at all of those things, those are the problems that everyone who is associated with this, whether they're aligned more with the traditional left or right, what's really distinct about them is that that's the thing they think is the most important problem to solve. Now, again, I think Tyler thinks, well, we need to get more state capacity because there's all kind of things the private sector could be doing that it could, but we need, a state that's actually going to be effective enough to release it. Ezra wants to really release the capacity of the public sector to do a lot of these things. But I think there's actually less disagreement on that than the traditional tribe they're associated with would suggest. And that's why I think there's an opportunity for a more radical abundance faction that's not really, that doesn't really make sense as moderate by the traditional left and right, because they have just a whole other set of issues that they want to inject and force the system to have to address.
Great. So talk to me about, and this is where I think this is the interesting evolution of your work. The key argument, though, in the piece, though, once you elucidate the abundance agenda, is about where the abundance faction should place itself within this existing two-party system, kind of the theory there, and why maybe longer term there's a opportunity for the abundance faction to exist in multiple configurations. But right now, this is that awkward time for choosing reality. Kind of talk about that.
So, okay, so this is the part of the argument I'll just admit, I feel like we don't put sort of bounds around our analysis enough and say, like, here's how confident I am, right? I'm pretty confident in the idea that this is the set of issues our system is not good at dealing with, right? And that's the ones that it has to figure out a way to address if we're gonna govern ourselves effectively. Who the constituency for that is a tougher call. And I have speculations in that Rob and I have speculations, but I'm going to have less confidence. But I'll go ahead and run into it anyways, and we'll see where we go. So part of the argument is I draw on the work of Hans Knoll, who has a great book on party ideologies in America. And the thing he argues is that actual realignments, tend to start, at least in his case, from intellectuals and ideologues first, right? So it's not that sort of basic social categories, right, end up changing underneath and the intellectuals come in later to kind of bless them, right? That's one story that we get told, is the intellectuals then, in Marxian terms, are just sort of superstructural, right? They're just there to go and kind of, wave, they're like priests who come in, like what you do a cross over something and say that it's holy, right? In our story, actually, the intellectuals come first, right? And they say, let's imagine some whole other dimension of politics. Let's imagine that we weren't talking about this, but we were talking about this. We were talking about some other dimension. And that allows people to say, wow, if that was the central dimension, then I might not be with the same people that I was with before. I might be with some very different people, right? Or there might be some new people who are coming into our system who weren't really part of the earlier alignment, right? Those people were not part of that, right? But there are new people who are like, I don't make sense in that older alignment, but I do make sense in this new alignment. But only once people at the idea level have allowed people to imagine what some other set of issues and some other kind of coalition would look like, can people start stitching that together and starting to organize people in a different way. And so the examples he gives are both of the American conservative movement, right? So people like William F. Buckley in the National Review are imagining a conservatism that has Southern segregationists and free market Western businessmen and, Catholic working class urban voters, right? Who are all over the place in the previous alignment, but they're saying, look, these people belong together, and they belong
Hmm.
together because there's an ideology called conservatism that would make them being together make sense, right? And the same thing is true of people writing in left of center publications, right? They created this modern liberalism that was different from New Deal liberalism, that was saying, look, African Americans and feminists and, and working people, they all belong together because this is going to be the central axis of politics, right?
Yep.
And I'm saying that's the way to start imagining this, right? Is this really is going to start with people writing in magazines and doing podcasts, right? This sound, now, of course, people throw out a lot of potential syntheses that never actually happen. Just because intellectuals are doing something doesn't mean it's going to happen. So my good friend Mike Lind, a few years ago was out there like writing books about the radical center, right? Well, the radical center just didn't happen, right? Now,
Hmm.
it might have been good if it happened, but it never happened. So the fact that intellectuals call on things to occur doesn't mean that they actually will occur. But I think that it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for political change, right? Then, okay, so let's imagine again in the Democratic Party, and this paper is about abundance Democrats, right?
Yep.
I think there's a potential abundance Republican coalition out there, but I think they're further from it than abundance Dems are, right? And so who are they, right? Well, one is I think we can already start to see them in places like San Francisco, right? The argument of the paper is this is happening at the city level before it's happening anywhere else, right? So San Francisco, there really is now, right, a really hard left, right? Those are the kind of people who got Chesa Boudin, right, as the Attorney General of
Yep.
or DA of San Francisco, right? There's a really hard left there, right? And they were, in charge of a lot of stuff in San Francisco for a while, right? But there's been real backlash against that. Some of it is YIMBY, right? Some of it is housing, right? I think a lot of that original organizing spirit were people who were like, no, we just need more. We just need to stop saying no and not trying to be super picky about what it is. We need to start saying yes, right? Some of that, like some of those same people got involved in things like the Diablo Canyon nuclear reactor, right? The question of whether to shut it down, right? And they were saying, no, right? We need more, we need more power. We can't just somehow all turn the lights off for 4 hours a day, right? I actually think, that, when you think about that energy and housing, right? Those are the same people who are like, no, we need to build infrastructure. We need to build, to finally like stop creating all these mechanism conflict and actually just start like building some things that allow people to move around in San Francisco, right? My theory of the case is that's going to meet up also with one part of some of this cultural stuff, right? So
Hmm.
some of that is, San Francisco's got this durable homelessness problem, right? And it's got people living on the street and doing drugs in the street. It's got a kind of social order problem. It's also got a problem in schools, right? So there was also that, that recall of the school board members, or at least people getting voted out on school board in San Francisco, not by people who were like conservative in any sense. They were like normies, right? And this is where my
Center
cultural,
left people who like Abraham Lincoln and don't think we need to cancel his name outside of elementary schools.
but it's also people who just don't think that's the most important thing the school's supposed to be doing, right? Part
Hmm.
of those, I think, are people who are like, whatever we think of Abraham Lincoln, right? This institution's got a lane, and it's not doing the thing it's supposed to be doing in that lane, right? And that in some sense, that schools have been captured by people who are trying to make it do a bunch of other cultural stuff that we just don't think that's what it's there for, right? And so I would say, when I imagine what this coalition is going to look like, right? It's going to look like a segment of working class, often immigrant people who really care about growth, right? They really care about there being more opportunity. They care about being able to afford a house, being able to afford their power bills, having schools that they trust to send their children to, that they don't think they're going to be constantly banging their head against the table saying that these people are bonkers because they can't afford to send their kid to somewhere else,
Mhm.
right? I think that's where you can start imagining this having a broader kind of coalition, right? That it's both people who want growth, opportunity, they want to push the price of things down, they want, in some sense, optimism, right? That's if you think about the kind of cultural vibe of this thing, is optimistic, is not being just constantly bummed out, right? That's the energy of a lot of the left of the Democratic Party is just bad vibes, to use an old
Mhm.
term, right?
Yeah.
Is just feeling bad about the country, feeling bad about where things are going, thinking the earth is gonna, is gonna blow up in a flaming ball of death, right? That's the vibe level. And I think the vibe level of this abundance faction is actually there's lots of things that we could create solutions for, right? They are there, right? We have the tools to do it, right? If we make our state structures work better, if we get science working more effectively, if we get things like schools and hospitals and universities all more focused on their core function, we actually could be wealthy and powerful. And this is the other part where I do think at some point, we'll talk about this later, and this is not my core area, but I do think at some point part of this coalition is going to come from the national security state, right? That they're going to be, just as actually some parts of civil rights and the war on poverty actually came from parts of national security saying, look, we have all these citizens who in selective service turn out just not to, we can't even take them in the military because they can't read or their health is bad, right? I think increasingly large parts of national security are going to say our fundamental ungovernability and low economic performance is just like a state survival imperative. And I think when you start adding up all those parts, you can imagine the parts, and then along with the general music of abundance that comes from intellectuals, you can imagine them all adding up to something.
Yeah, so I'm taking notes so I can make sure to signpost this. Um, so number one, when it comes to a political movement viability question, something I'm really fascinated by is I actually have a copy of The Radical Center by Lind and Ted Halstead somewhere on the bookshelf here. So I thought a lot about this. And this was a 2000s era movement intellectually. Like New America, the think tank at the time, New America Foundation, was very much structured around being the centerpiece of that movement. And I think a principal problem they ran into is that political movements have to identify serious problems that need to be solved. Because if you just that need to be solved beyond just like your own specific like interests. And I think the radical center movement ran into a problem where the problem they were trying to solve is there are always like smart, heterodox 30 and 40 something think tank type people who were kind of bored with like late 1990s Democratic Republican politics. And they were trying to solve a problem by creating a new space for themselves. I wouldn't define that as like a problem. And you could disagree with that, but like from my personal perspective, reading those books 20 years later, I don't see that as a problem on the level of, let's say, another example, which undergirds my thought, the reform conservatism movement from the mid 2010s. I think this is a fascinating example of a movement that identifies an actual serious problem in the political system, but ends up being somewhat superseded slash incorrect in their actual response to that. So reform conservatism is a movement that really comes out of like late 2000s realizations that, hey, actually, it turns out the GOP is increasingly dependent on these like working class, like middle class, non-college educated voters. And actually, it turns out whether or not we like the tax cutting and growth agenda, our voters actually really, really, really do not like that agenda. And we get by on cultural means. Therefore, let's create this opportunity to create an agenda that's more actually in sync with them. However, what you then see happen, despite the excitement of reform conservatism in the mid 2010s, is Donald Trump reveals that you can actually accomplish a lot of those goals, not merely through wonky AEI papers, but actually by aggressive takes on immigration, aggressive sociocultural values that expose the fact that those working class GOP voters actually have serious value disagreements with, let's say, the Bernie folks with the center left, and therefore that those value disagreements are just as salient. So like that's a good example there. So lastly,
Wait. Can I just get
yeah,
on that before I forget everything you just said?
yeah.
Because I think you know, in part because I'm so close to Mike Lind. And I'm not afraid to admit it. I'm saying it here on this podcast. One problem with that is, so again, if you take my theory, right? So the thing has to start with some core of intellectuals, right? People who have a real different belief, right? They have an idea, right? Then, just like in any movement building thing, right? You don't just jump from them to like the mass public, right?
Mhm.
Why you have to think like an organizer, right? The next concentric circle around that, right, is you need to start building durable, distinct organizations around that, right? And I think actually the abundance thing is actually starting to get to that stage. So I'm at the Niskanen Center. We're very much they published the paper. A lot of our programming is around that, but there's lots of others we name check. A lot of them, I think the Breakthrough Institute is also in this, Institute for Progress. I can go through all the other
FAI, this podcast sponsor, is a
FAI,
part of this.
right, is all that, right. My former colleague Sam Hammond is at FAI, right. There's a lot of, I think increasingly there is a kind of organizational universe that's building around that, right. And connected to that movement building is, I think there's a set of donors who are starting to identify their, philanthropic political, objective as building that movement. Now, again, this is where, the same, conservatives went through the same thing. They had to build this network of people who thought of their way of doing their philanthropic work was to associate themselves with a set of sort of intellectuals and organizers, right? So that's a part of that organizing thing. Those people need to connect to one another, and sort of think of themselves as having unit cohesion and start to
Mhm.
strategize about what the other parts of the organizational universe that have to come into being just in the way that conservatives did, right? And then, right, you need to have at least a few politicians who want to who feel constrained by the existing dimension of politics and want to break out into some new one, who think that that's too constraining, right? And again, I think a lot of that is, in this case, is going to come up from the municipal level, right? People are going to do this. They're going to get in big fights at the state and city level, and they're going to use those fights to go and push themselves up to greater success. And having people see that, when people see that this set of ideas can actually allow you to differentiate and actually win elections, is going to cause more people to align in that way. But you have to think about this again as actually taking a while and involving a lot of different people. And at some point, it's also going to mean that like students are going to start looking up and saying, I don't feel like I'm, with either of these existing parties. I'm not a Bernie bro. I'm not a Donald Trump person, right? And then someone's going to say, what you actually are, you're actually an abundance dim or whatever, right? And they're going to start organizing on the campus level. And that's going to be part of it. And those people are then going to be the ones who become legislative assistants in Congress or junior think tank people or people who are running campaigns, right? And so when I think about how this actually happens, the electorate is kind of the part that comes last, right? You have to do a
Mhm.
whole lot of other things until you're really at the position where you can start getting voters to start aligning to this thing. You have to do a lot of that work first.
Yeah, and I think the last thing that I'll add on to that addendum is, and this is actually why I'm very bullish on the abundance agenda from a political perspective, because like, as I was saying, I think intellectually fueled political movements have to solve problems for institutions, ambitious politicians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I genuinely think one of the reasons why Gavin Newsom will never be president of the United States is California is seen as the state that is the state where they spend 20 years trying to build a high-speed railroad but can't build it. It's a state where housing is just out of control and unaffordable. The price of higher education skyrockets. If you're a Gavin Newsom type person, this agenda has a very direct response to political problems that you experience in your life. And this also explains why, and this is why you two aren't being hackish when you say, oh, like, this is going to be for Democrats, because the issue is right now, the politicians and the institutions and the activist organizations who have abundance related problems are people who mostly live in coastal blue state environments where these things exist. Texas, for example, love Texas and based in Texas. Texas is a red state that actually is great on housing construction. It's complicated, but compared to California, this isn't quite. There's a different set of political circumstances where I think the energy side of abundance is much more relevant to Texas. But I just think that coastal Democrats who recognize that the traditional left leaning activist organizations not only can't help them win on an office anymore, but B don't have actual answers to these problems beyond just the subsidy cycle are going to be looking for something alternative that also fits into a period of budget constraint, where you can't just say, okay, the UC system's too expensive. We're going to pass a $400 billion bill making it the 1960s again and have it be free for everybody. No one serious thinks that's on the table. Therefore, you need to have something else. And I think the abundance agenda provides an example of that.
And this is where, again, this is probably where we should end for now. But I actually think that idea, California is not a bad example of this, right? Is that this is going to go national, probably because somebody is going to be getting in fights in San Francisco. They're going to be using that getting in fights along with other people. It's not just going to be them all the way out there on their own, but they're going to be getting in fights. That's going to get people attention. It's going to turn out that there are voters who like it when they're given it. This is why this is a kind of entrepreneurial theory of politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
The thing doesn't, people don't already know that they want abundance until they're given it. And then when they're given it, they're like, hey, that's great. An iPhone. I didn't want an iPhone. I wasn't sitting around thinking I should have a phone and email and everything in my hand. But now that I got it, I like it, right? And then having done that, and then it looked, and then again, your point, till it turns out, one, that you can actually solve problems, you can actually govern that way and things happen, and that voters respond to it, right? That then is going to cause people to take bigger risks, right? So Gavin Newsom is an interesting example of this, right? He came up very much out of the kind of Democratic interest group coalition, San Francisco, right? You can tell on some of these issues, he realizes that, being associated with just the groups is not great politics. And he has differentiated himself somewhat, right? But what's going to happen is the person who's going to come behind Gavin Newsom is going to say, the way you do this is you go all in, right?
Mm-hmm.
There now is a totally rich set of intellectuals. We've got books that we can point to and wave around and know that that's the thing we believe, right? And that we actually have answers on a whole bunch of things. So I'm going to go all in on that, right? And then somebody's going to go all in on that in a state like California, and it's going to turn out that there's a coalition for it, or they're going to do it in Michigan, or they're going to do it and again, I think, mostly in blue states where they're going to do that by challenging the people who are associated with what you might think of as the ancien regime of the American state. And those are going to be the state builders and, again, elected officials of this next generation, in the way that people like Teddy Roosevelt were, right? Teddy Roosevelt came up out of when his first job was New York police commissioner, right? That's a classic example of the kind of way that urban politics may be the forcing thing through which people will then go into these other kind of levels.
So last word on this, because we're going to have to do a part 2 on this later in the summer. A topic I'm fascinated to discuss with you during that next episode is kind of this idea of an abundance politician, and how this agenda is going to actually, to your point, Teddy Roosevelt, civil service commissioner, army colonel, police commissioner, governor, et cetera, was he was conceived differently than a politician of the 1870s and 1880s. So politician types are going to have to change. And we think of Gavin Newsom, let's say in the 2000s, he is the gay marriage politician. His big national thing was in 2004. He was the first mayor to push gay marriage. He was during a political era, because he got elected so young, where the job of a center-left Democratic politician was activism. It was advancing rights. It was advancing spoils to folks who'd been excluded in the past. What's awkward, though, for politicians from that generation is we enter into this period where we're noticing these problems of abundance. We actually need politicians who can actually build things, where it's taken as a given. No, we know you like LGBTQ people, but our housing is a disaster here. What can you do about that? And their model can't answer that traditionally.
Can I just add something as a last point? I think this is the thing setting up the next conversation we have. your point about, right, people who came from a previous generation where they had a certain set of tools, right? Whatever the problem was, right? If you're a Democrat, that you give people some new right, right? If you're a Republican or conservative, well, you give people, you cut their taxes,
Yeah.
right? And that's kind of the Democratic and Republican parties for a
That's the
long time,
offer.
right?
That's the deal.
That's what they've got, right? But at some point, you can't solve your problem with that set of tools. And so the example I would give in Britain was like Liz Truss. Liz Truss is sort of an interesting, a very idiosyncratic individual. I'll just specify that, right? And her chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, who's a very interesting guy. They actually, in some ways, had the right diagnosis that Britain was having a problem of just durably slow growth. And I know this because, she tweeted out my book, The Captured Economy, and said, this is a great book and everything, right? So she understood that and was really prioritizing. And then they got into government. And what did they do? They cut taxes, right? That was, and that's a lot of why her and Kwasi Kwarteng were in for like 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So again, they had the right diagnosis, they'd identified the problem, and they were responding with tools of the previous form of conservatism, right? I think you're going to see some of that, in a way. I think Biden has had some of those same problems, right? He sort of got, when you got the idea, right? This is why he prioritized infrastructure and technology, right? But he did it mostly through subsidy, right? Not through fundamentally changing the underlying structure of the state in order to make it better at actually driving productivity. And that's why we're just not going to get as much change in energy and housing or any of these other things as people thought, or at least Bidenomics said it was going to get, right? And that's why I think the Democrat who comes in after this, having seen that experience and having seen the limits of the Democratic coalition, is going to have to do something pretty different.
That is a perfect place to end part one. Stephen, this has been really great. We will link all of the reference papers, books, etc. in the show notes. I'll see you again soon on the show.
All right. Thank you, Marshall.